Late in the 15th century, France sat in a rare position of strength. Power gathered at the top, and at the top stood Charles VIII, a very young king who already carried the weight of the state. His rule reached into laws, taxes, and loyalty, but it also reached into the daily rhythm of the court. He brought that moving centre of power to the Château of Amboise. At Amboise, government did not stop, but it changed shape. Decisions still waited, messengers still arrived, and favours still mattered. Yet the court also needed a way to hold itself together. Shared routines did that work. Meals, ceremonies, and small competitions created order when many ambitious people lived close to a single crown. Leisure became part of how authority stayed visible and stable. Among those routines, one game stood out, jeu de paume. It looked like tennis in its earliest form, played with quick reflexes and a hard driving ball. Courtiers watched, played, and judged one another through it, because skill at play could mean closeness to power. The young king joined that world too. At Amboise, sport and rule moved side by side every day. In 1494, Charles VIII shifted from leisure to war. He launched a campaign into Italy, and the change hit the court immediately. The same circle that had organised games now handled orders, money, and movement. Charles aimed for more than a border raid. He wanted a crown, a reputation, and proof that France could reach beyond its own frontiers. Ambition stopped being a mood. It became a plan. Italy offered both temptation and opportunity. It was rich, divided, and full of rival powers that mistrusted each other. Charles believed speed would solve everything. If he marched fast and struck hard, cities would open their gates and opponents would fall apart. So he gathered men, supplies, and allies, and he pushed south. The court followed the king's rhythm now. Every day became about the next decision. The campaign turned Charles into a different kind of ruler. He no longer only presided, he commanded. Success had to arrive quickly because a long war drained cash and loyalty, and each step into Italy created new fear among other rulers who watched France move closer to their own interests. That was the hidden cost of glory. The more Charles chased conquest, the more enemies he quietly made behind him. By 1495, the easy rush of Charles's Italian campaign faded. Early wins looked decisive, then the ground shifted under him. Other powers in Italy treated his success as a threat, not a triumph to admire. They began to coordinate against him, tightening the space around his army. The same bold march that had carried him forward now created a problem. It gave his enemies time to organize. Retreat sounded simple, but it demanded hard choices. Charles had to pull men back through hostile territory, with supplies strained and allies turning uncertain. Every mile home carried risk. An ambush, a blocked crossing, a sudden attack that could shatter the column. His goal stopped being glory and became survival. He worked to keep the army intact and to escape before the coalition closed in. The campaign began to unravel into a fighting withdrawal. When Charles reached France again, the return felt less like a victory parade and more like a warning delivered in person. He had seen how quickly triumph created fear and how fear produced alliances. His ambition had not just won cities, it had united opponents. That lesson followed him home. Italy did not stay in Italy. It changed how other rulers viewed him, and it changed what he could safely attempt next. In 1497, Charles settled back into Amboise and tried to make the court feel ordinary again. After the shock of Italy, routine became a kind of medicine. Councils met, messages arrived, decisions stacked up, and between those pressures, the king leaned on familiar habits. Jeu de paume returned as a regular break in the day. Something physical and simple that reminded everyone of calmer times. But normal life did not mean easy life. Every choice Charles made carried the weight of what had just happened beyond the Alps. Allies had shifted, rivals watched closely. Money had to be found, reputations repaired, and future moves discussed without showing weakness. In that climate, the game mattered more than it seemed. It gave the court a controlled way to gather around the king, to appear steady even when plans stayed uncertain. So the pattern set in. Politics, planning, then a game. The king moved between paperwork and play, keeping the machine of rule running while trying to look untroubled. Courtiers followed his lead, reading his mood, measuring how secure their world really felt. Jeu de paume became a familiar scene again, not as a luxury, but as a signal. Life continued, the crown held, and that belief guided everyone into the next day. On April 7, 1498, Charles left the routines of government behind for something simple. He went to watch Jeu de paume at Amboise. It was not a grand ceremony, just a king moving through the Château, the way he had many times before. He took a low passage that connected one part of the residence to another. He walked quickly, and in that ordinary movement, risk hid in plain sight. The passage stayed low enough that a tall man needed to pay attention. Charles did not. As he went through, his head struck the door lintel hard. There was no sword, no battlefield, no assassin. Just wood and stone, and a moment of misjudgment. The impact landed high and sharp, the kind that stunned the body before the mind caught up. The king kept moving, but the injury had already happened. He reached the game he came to see, and for a brief moment, life seemed to continue as normal. That was the trap of it. A head blow could look minor at first, even to the people closest to him. Yet this was the fatal new development of his reign, an accident that could not be negotiated with and could not be undone. From that instant, under the lintel, Charles's future started to narrow. After the impact, Charles did not drop to the ground. He kept moving, and for a little while, that mattered. To everyone around him, it looked like a painful mishap, not a royal emergency. He carried on with the simple routines of the day. He watched, he listened, he reacted. The court took its cues from him. If the king seemed steady, then the danger seemed over. But head injuries rarely announced themselves in a clean, predictable way. In the hours that followed, the early confidence began to fade. His behavior shifted. His strength failed in small steps, then in clearer ones. What first looked like recovery started to look like delay. Inside his skull, damage could spread without warning, as swelling and bleeding built pressure, and that pressure did not need a second blow to become lethal. As his condition worsened, the people nearest to him had to confront a frightening possibility. The king had been walking, speaking, and acting while a fatal injury already took hold. The signs became harder to dismiss. The change was no longer subtle. In a court used to reading every gesture of the monarch, this was unmistakable. The accident had not ended at the doorway. It had only started there, and time worked against him. Later that day, the limits of what the court could do became clear. Charles's body no longer held steady. The decline that had seemed confusing, even temporary, turned sudden and unmistakable. He collapsed. There was no long warning and no gradual farewell. The king died, and it happened fast enough to leave everyone around him scrambling to understand what they had just witnessed. The shock was not only personal, it was political. A king did not simply represent a man, he carried the state on his shoulders. With Charles gone, every decision that depended on his authority froze in place. Orders, appointments, military plans, everything waited for a new hand to sign them. In an instant, a head injury at court became a national emergency. Then the hardest fact settled in. Charles left no direct heir ready to take the crown. That single detail changed the meaning of his death. It raised the question of who ruled next and how smooth or dangerous the change might be. In France, uncertainty at the top could invite rivalry, panic, and opportunism. The accident had ended a life, and it had opened a crisis. By nightfall, the question shifted from how the king died to who ruled next. Charles left no living son to inherit, so the crown passed sideways through the royal family. It went to Louis XII, a cousin from another branch of the Valois dynasty. France did not fall into chaos, but the balance at court changed immediately. A new king meant new allies, new rivals, and new priorities. Louis XII inherited more than a throne. He inherited unfinished business. Charles had tied France's future to the Italian wars, and that policy did not vanish with the accident at Amboise. It simply changed hands. Louis brought his own reasons to push into Italy, and his rule quickly pointed the state back toward the same dangerous theatre. One death had ended a reign, but it had not ended the ambition. The effect was immediate and practical. The plans made under Charles were reviewed, reshaped, and then put to use by a different mind. Offices shifted, loyalties realigned, and the court learned to speak a new king's language. What looked like a freak personal tragedy became a political turning point. France stayed on the path toward Italy, but now every decision carried the mark of Louis XII, not Charles VIII. In the years that followed, the death refused to settle into silence. Chroniclers kept returning to the same hard-to-ignore detail. A crowned king ended by a low doorway. It felt wrong to them, almost like the world had broken its own rules. So they recorded it again and again, not as a private mishap, but as a public lesson. The more they wrote, the more the accident became the story. Writers did not treat it like a simple slip of fate. They treated it like a warning. If a man believed to rule by God's favour could be brought down by ordinary stone and timber, then nobody stood above everyday danger. The story travelled because it made sense of fear people already lived with. One bad step, one low beam, one moment of carelessness, and power vanished. Over decades, historians used the death to explain medieval life in plain terms. Grand titles did not change the risks of crowded buildings and uneven spaces. The king's end became a shorthand example, repeated whenever people talked about how fragile life was, even at the top. It hardened into a cautionary tale, less about politics and more about vulnerability. An anointed ruler had met a hazard any servant might have met. In the end, Charles VIII's name stayed attached to a doorway more than to a policy. People still pointed to Amboise and to that simple mistake, one step, one misjudged clearance, as if it explained the whole reign. The details survived because the court recorded them and because the shock never really faded. A king, protected by titles and ceremony, still fell to something ordinary. That was why the story endured. It felt too small for the consequence, and yet it happened in full view of the people who mattered most. Later writers did not need rumours or legends. They had a timeline, witnesses, and an outcome that arrived fast. The record made the accident feel undeniable, almost clinical. The more it was documented, the stranger it seemed. And it sat in hard contrast to the image of royal confidence that once surrounded him. The court at play, the king moving easily among familiar rituals. That picture ended not in battle, not in ceremony, but in a sudden, awkward blow. It reduced power to a fragile body in a narrow space. That was what people remembered, not the reign, an instant that erased it.